Returning now to politics, this weekend, the temperature in Washington heated up on many fronts, from more talk of a trade war with China to increasingly harsh words about immigration. The president was again on the offensive. Is there a theme to the president's words? NewsHour Weekend special correspondent Jeff Greenfield is here with some perspective, a thread, a through line.
Yeah, and I think you particularly see it when you watch the changes in the personnel around the White House. One thing that Trump has been totally consistent about for decades is we're being ripped off by foreigners. They're eating our lunch in every trade deal, and they're sending marauding bands of immigrants across our borders to do terrible things. Now that's policy. So you have the idea of a trade war, which he says you can win easily, coupled with the extremely harsh rhetoric about immigrants. Now they're voting illegally all over California. And I think the threat is that when you look at who now is surrounding the president, Gary Cohn, who was a free trader, is gone as a key economic advisor, replaced by Larry Kudlow, who thinks that tariffs are terrific. The so-called internationalists, like McMaster, the national security advisor, Rex Tillerson, as Secretary of State, they're gone, replaced by John Bolton and probably Mike Pompeo, much more nationalistic in their approach. So the idea that we heard a couple of years ago that, well, the grown-ups will restrain Trump and put him on a more conventional course. No, the people around him now, in fact, are reinforcing those very core instincts of the president's.
What are the political consequences of this for House and Senate candidates up for re-election in just a few months?
Well, on the issue of trade, this is really going to cause and has caused an enormous problem with the Republicans, because in the farm states, and there still are states where farming is important, where a lot of vulnerable Democratic senators are up for re-election, the idea of a trade war, if it happens, is going to clobber the agricultural economy. And you're talking about states like Montana, Missouri, North Dakota, many others. The problem for the Republicans is, broadly speaking, the president is so popular among Republicans that they're caught. They can't attack him. He's the leader of our party. But they don't want to see a trade policy like he's enunciating become reality. The other thing I think to remember about this is one of Trump's notions about himself is he's a master negotiator. And The Art of the Deal, to quote one of his books, suggests that you begin with a kind of maximalist opening bargaining stance. Mm-hmm. If that were to work, if his threats result in a deal with China where they curb some of their clearly unfair practices, that's going to be a win. But the question is whether China is amenable to that kind of negotiation. That is very much up in the air and could be a huge political problem for the Republicans in the fall.
So in the topic of immigration, would that now, his actions again, be consistent with this sort of thesis that you can read about in his books?
I think it's more primal than that. This is something that he has talked about from the time when he was a feature of New York tabloids. And I think one of the things that we saw this week is the other thing about Donald Trump is he's a showman, right? He plays to the base. So he goes to an event that's supposed to celebrate the tax cuts. And what does he do? He literally throws away the prepared takes. This is boring.
That would have been a little boring. A little boring.
And goes off on one of his harshest rants yet about illegal immigrants. I mean, to me, it's like he knows what gets the crowd going. You know, what are we going to do? Build a wall. Who's going to pay for it? Mexico. And when Trump stands up in front of a crowd, it's kind of like a Led Zeppelin reunion. You know you're going to hear Stairway to Heaven. Right. And you're going to hear him bash immigrants.
Is there, while we end up spending attention on this, you point out there are important stories that are undercovered.
I always like to kind of remind people that there's stuff going on behind the headlines. This past week, Judge Stephen Reinhardt died. He's a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeal out west, probably the most liberal federal judge in the entire country. And that Court of Appeals has been the bane of conservatives for years because it's fundamentally dominated by liberals. So there are now 8 vacancies on that court, part of 100 federal vacancies that he and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell are determined to fill as quickly as possible. So much so that McConnell is about to 86, a long-standing tradition in the Senate, that a home state senator can block a federal judge from his or her state.
A blue slip idea.
A blue slip, even if it's from the other party. Now, you look at what's coming of those 100 federal vacancies, and unless the Democrats take the Senate in the fall, they're going to have a fundamental reshaping of the federal bench. And meanwhile, if one of the centrist or liberal Supreme Court justices were to leave, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Anthony Kennedy, Trump is going to be able to reshape that court in a way that will be by far the most consequential political action he will have taken in his first term.
The president's also been on the defensive about Scott Pruitt and the challenges that he's facing at the EPA. This weekend he came out with a tweet, and I'm just going to read it rather quickly. While security spending was somewhat more than his predecessor, Scott Pruitt has received death threats because of his bold actions at EPA, record clean air and water, while saving USA billions of dollars. Rent was about market rate, travel expenses okay. Scott is doing a great job. In the length of one tweet, there's at least a half dozen inaccuracies there, but does it even matter?
The conduct that Scott Pruitt is under fire for is exactly the kind of conduct that conservatives say that's what big government, swampy bureaucrats do. Yeah, adding on, tripling the security staff and wanting a bulletproof desk and asking the security detail to run sirens so he can get to a restaurant on time, and then moving that security guy out when he won't do it. When somebody's on your side, the conduct looks much more defensible than if that guy were on the other side of the political divide. And that's true, by the way, across the board.
All right, Jeff Greenfield, thanks so much.
Okay.